Hey folks, welcome to The Artist Craft. I'm your host Stacey Cochran, and we are thrilled to have in studio today Robert Morgan. Robert is the author of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, noted most for his novel Gap Creek and Boone, his biography of Daniel Boone, both of which were national bestsellers. A professor at Cornell University since 1971 and visiting writer-in-residence at half a dozen universities. His awards include Guggenheim and Rockefeller Fellowships and an Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Literature. He was inducted into the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame in 2010, and he is currently on tour for his latest book, Lions of the West, Heroes and Villains of the Westward Expansion. Thank you very much for joining us in studio today.
Oh, my pleasure. Good to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about the new book, Lions of the West. What's the story about for folks unfamiliar with it?
Well, after I finished the biography of Daniel Boone, I wanted to continue the story of the westward expansion, the settlement further west in Kentucky, and I had a discussion with my publisher and editor, should we do a biography of Crockett or Carson or Sam Houston? But I said to my publisher, the leader, the founding father who was most influential in expanding the country to the west was Thomas Jefferson, who dreamed about a United States that went across the mountains and across the Mississippi from the time he was young. And oddly enough, the man who signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, acquiring everything from Texas to the Pacific, was Jefferson's grandson-in-law, Nicholas P. Trist, working for the State Department. And my publisher said, oh, that's a wonderful idea. We begin with Jefferson and end with his grandson-in-law. And I decided to tell the story of the westward expansion through a series of linked biographies of Andrew Jackson, Sam Houston, David Crockett, and surprisingly, Johnny Appleseed. That's the surprise of that series. I thought that by telling the stories of each of these figures, I could somehow make their lives resonate off of each other. And I say at the beginning, I know the real work of westward expansion was done to a great extent by the unnamed tens of thousands of people who went into Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Texas. But we have to tell the story mostly through these better known figures who did decisive things, important things. And of course I end with the Mexican War, and I had an excuse to study Mexican history for about a year. And Mexican historians, I decided that their story was a part of our story.
And the author is Robert Morgan. The book that he's on tour for that we're talking about is Lions of the West. So which of the figures in the book did you enjoy writing and researching on the most? Which of the figures in the book?
The two figures who were most surprising to me were General Winfield Scott, about whom I knew very little, but came to admire a great deal. Many military historians consider him the finest tactician in American history. And he, in a way, was the mentor of Robert E. Lee, of Grant, Jackson. They were with him in Mexico, and all of them had a very high opinion of him. 6'4", 300 pounds, French chef, fluent in French, a classical scholar, and old fuss and feathers, they called him, because he loved fine uniforms and ceremonies. The other person who was a real surprise to me was Kit Carson. Carson, with Boone, is almost certainly the greatest scout of American frontier history. He was illiterate. He was a little fellow among big men physically. He ran away to the West when he was 16, became a mountain man, fluent in Spanish, Canadian French, more than half a dozen Indian languages. He was a great interpreter, translator, had a photographic mind. My favorite understatement in this history is from the chapter on Carson. Fremont is going up the Missouri River, 1842, and he meets somebody named Carson and says, I'm looking for somebody to guide me to the Rocky Mountains. And Carson, who's a very humble man, said, I've spent some time in the mountains. I think I can take you wherever you want to go.
What a great story. So what made Winfield Scott, can you give a specific example from his military history that made him a brilliant tactician? Was there a particular battle or strategy that he used?
I would say there are three things that made him such a great general. One was he had enormous patience, and he would try to think like his enemy, to anticipate what the enemy was going to do. Third, he perfected in the War of 1812 a maneuver of seeming to fight to send out a probing force in front of an enemy while sending his major force behind the enemy. And he defeated the Mexicans 3 times that way. They never caught on. Every time they would push back the probing force and have a great celebration of their victory over the Americans while he was moving his artillery and his army behind them to blow them to pieces. But I would say his greatest asset as a general was his ability to anticipate what the enemy was going to do, to understand what they assumed about him. Lee was studying that very carefully, and with the Army of Northern Virginia, we can see that is exactly the lesson he put to such good use.
And in contrast to that patience, it seems Andrew Jackson was one who was very quick-tempered. You describe him in the book as first to last, a seriously flawed man. What were Jackson's biggest flaws, and how did they hurt or even fuel his career?
It's all mixed up together, his virtues and his weaknesses. He had a terrible temper, which he worked all of his life to control, though sometimes we know he could fake tantrums for effect. He's one of the most interesting and complex figures in American history because he had such great talents, he was so accomplished, and he did bad things. He really was flawed, but I would say he had the biggest heart in some ways, the greatest sympathy of any leader of his time. That he had friends as different as James K. Polk, a very austere, determined politician, and Sam Houston, who was a rollicking, good old boy, very much the extrovert. They were both his favorite proteges. He had that kind of range in his personality and in his mind. And I think his great willpower, his determination, he had patience also. He pursued the Creeks when everybody had given up, when his army had been recalled. He was like Washington at Valley Forge. He hung in there, he stuck it out. He knew what he wanted, and he won. And he treated the Creeks, who had been his allies, cruelly by taking their land, even so. But he was not an Indian hater, in my opinion. He actually liked Indians. He adopted 2 Indians as his own sons. And the man he defeated at Horseshoe Bend, Red Eagle, became William Weatherford and trained racehorses for him at the Hermitage.
So was it that his real ire, his real hatred was towards the British, and he saw the Creeks siding with the British?
Exactly. When the Creeks were being aided by the Spanish and the British, these outside powers, he was determined to put them down. He would not let anything stand in the way of the westward expansion of the United States. He believed in liberty, he believed in democracy, he believed in the country, and you're absolutely right. He hated the British from the time he was a teenager in the Revolution, when a British officer had cut him with a saber and treated him very cruelly. He never lost that hate for the British.
Fascinating. The author, again, is Robert Morgan. The book that we're talking about is Lions of the West. I'd love it if you'd read a passage about Andrew Jackson from this. So many fascinating figures, so many wonderful figures to draw from in the book. But perhaps the passage on page 57, starting with Andrew Jackson would be.
Right. This is a part of my introduction to Jackson. Andrew Jackson, later called Old Hickory by the whites, and Sharp Knife and Old Mad Jackson by the Creeks, was born March 13, 1767, near Waxhaw on the North Carolina-South Carolina border. His father died before he was born, and Jackson's mother, Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson, served as housekeeper for a prosperous relative while she raised her 3 sons. Throughout his boyhood, he was always aware that he was a poor relation. His mother inspired him to be independent, but careful to cultivate friends and to think of himself as a leader. From the beginning, he had a terrible temper and never turned away from a fight. His character showed a relentless will, a sometime brutality that alternated with great loyalty and tenderness toward his friends, women, children, and the weak and dependent. Studying the life of Jackson, one cannot help but feel there is an inevitability about him. Jackson seemed always driven by forces much larger than himself. He was the personification and genius of the spirit of the frontier. He was the essence of the pioneer will, raised to the second power. He seems at once a creation of history, possessed by its demons, and the creator of much of the history of his era and region, the perfect expression of the will and passion and aspiration of the people of his times. He became one of the most popular presidents in the history of the United States. Americans have been described as both bullies and saints, and the label fits nobody better than Andrew Jackson.
Very nice. So where do you think your love of history comes from? Where does it originate from?
Well, my dad had never gone beyond the 6th grade in school, but he loved to read history, and he was a great storyteller. And I grew up with somebody who could talk endlessly, wonderful, colorful stories about Washington, about the Revolution, about the Civil War, about the bottling up of Butler, about Lee at Gettysburg. And he knew a lot about the Indians plowing in the fields up there on that little farm. We turned up arrowheads and pieces of pottery, and he told stories about the Indians, about Daniel Boone. He said we were related to Daniel Boone. So I was born to an interest in history. And this book, Lions of the West, is dedicated to Mrs. Elizabeth Rogers, who was my 11th grade American history teacher. So I had some good teaching in history. History is storytelling. And in my poetry and in my fiction, I've used a lot of history. A lot of it is set in the past. So it was always there.
Fascinating story. You know, for a lot of folks whose parents did not go very far academically, that tends to be a setback for them, but it hasn't been for you. You've dedicated your life to academia and have taught at Cornell since 1971 and done a number of visiting professorships as well. What drove you to pursue such rigorous, an intellect's life?
Well, though I grew up on literally a one-horse farm. We did not have a truck or car or tractor. We plowed with a horse, kept our milk and butter in the spring house. I tell my students I have 1 foot in the 19th century. But in fact, my parents were readers and talkers. My grandpa was a great storyteller. We read the Bible every day. My parents discussed the Bible. We went to prayer meeting, and there was an awful lot of what you might call philosophical discourse in these discussions of theology and biblical history and that sort of thing. It surprised me when I went off to school that I was better educated in many ways than the middle class students I knew at Emory when I went there, because of these parents and because of the bookmobile that came to Green River Church, Henderson County bookmobile, every Monday afternoon of every month. And I went there and got book after book. Little House on the Prairie, I got Jack London, I got Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe. So it was always there. I had a great grandpa who fought in the Confederate Army, who had an original Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. So that strain of scholarship, in a sense, was always there on that mountain farm. But I went off to college and actually studied applied mathematics and aerospace engineering here at NC State for a while. Wandered into a writing class with Guy Owen. I brought in a little story I'd written about my great-grandmother who could remember the Civil War. She had been a little girl in Walterboro, South Carolina when Sherman came through, and she could remember bodies heaped on their porch. I wrote a little story about that, and Guy Owen brought it into class and said, I wept when I read this story. And that just hooked me on writing. I mean, nobody had given me that sort of praise before. So I thought less and less about differential equations and more about how to write a living English sentence, something I'm still working on.
So it's a combination of tremendous talent, which you're a modest man, you probably wouldn't say, but a tremendous talent and wonderful mentors.
Wonderful teachers, Guy Owen at NC State, Jesse Rader at UNC Chapel Hill, and Fred Chappell at UNC Greensboro. I was very lucky in my teachers.
Do you consider yourself a religious person?
I do, though not in the more obvious traditional ways. But yes, I usually read the Bible every day, and I think of myself as a spiritual person, and also think of myself as a student of the phenomenon of belief, particularly as a novelist. I've written a number of works of fiction about ministers, people who wanted to be ministers. That fascinates me a great deal.
Well, that was one of the things I wanted to ask about, was how does religion serve the purpose of a novel like This Rock, particularly in establishing the characters of Muir and Moody? So how does religion, as you're thinking about framing a novel, how does it factor into establishing a character?
Because religion is so much a part of the fabric of the lives of the people I write about, you couldn't leave it out. And I didn't want to make religion seem, some extraordinary thing like snake handling and that sort of thing, but to show how important it was to people in the world I grew up in, the world of my ancestors, and to treat it as a part of daily life. In the case of Muir, somebody who wants to be a minister and to build a church on top of a mountain. And by the way, I'm just finishing a sequel to Gap Creek and This Rock, where Muir is still at that job. He still has that aspiration.
Very nice. And you have a new book of poetry out as
I do.
Well. Tell us a little bit about the new book.
It's called terroir, which is simply the French word for soil or dirt, used by wine connoisseurs and writers, meaning a particular wine, a particular combination of things. And I've written so much about agriculture and nature, it seemed like a good idea. I've never had two books come out at exactly the same time, and Lions of the West and Terroir came out at exactly the same time, October of 2011.
So in the 1970s, when you were first becoming established as a writer, you published almost exclusively poetry. But then starting in the 1980s, you began publishing short stories. What was the catalyst for that transition? Was it a difference in the receptivity of literary journals, or was it just you'd written a lot of poetry and you were ready to try your hand at short stories?
Well, I started out to be a short story writer here at NC State, working with Guy Owen and also at UNC Chapel Hill. I always read poetry, was interested in poetry, but I fell in with a group of students at Chapel Hill, mostly from the Northeast, who'd been kicked out of the finest prep schools in New England and had come to Chapel Hill to be beatniks and writers. And they could talk about poetry. They could talk about metaphor and French poetry and William Butler Yeats. And I hung around and listened to them and began to write poetry. And the poetry took me over. I didn't choose it. It chose me. And I just wrote more and more poetry. It was rewarded, reinforced so quickly with fellowships, prizes, publication. And when I was 26 years old, Cornell University invited me to come there and teach poetry workshops while A. Emmons was on sabbatical. So I went up there for 1 year and have been there ever since.
What a great
But
story.
to answer the second part of your question, I went back to fiction writing in the 1980s because I wanted to write in voices other than my own. And I wanted to tell some of those wonderful stories about the Civil War, the Revolution, about the Indians that I'd heard by the fireplace when I was a kid. And I couldn't do that in verse, so I very slowly began to write fiction again.
Well, the author is Robert Morgan. He is on tour for Lions of the West. So many wonderful books to choose from, though, in interviewing you. This could easily be like a 2-day interview, I think, if we wanted it to be. Would you mind reading some of your poetry?
Not at all. This is called Paradise's Fool, playing on Fool's Paradise, obviously. In the apple tree, abloom at the field's edge, and the hummingbird's nest of moss and plant down, in the canicles of the star maiden, and subtle aesthetics of failure, the severalty of tidelands, duff of fence rows, word amulets, stench of traffic in the electron. I am Paradise's fool. See the grapery and mariculture, whole alloys of people, singing plants, nut groves, and the clitoris sharp as a phonograph needle scoring circles of music. Lo, whirls without beginning in the spring's contact lens, the haunted well and camphor wood. Neither in Surview nor Sweet Vale do I escape the terror, the presence of the comforter. You can see I'm beginning to work with rhyme in that poem. That was probably written 30 years ago.
So when you think back to your life at that point, when you were writing some of your earlier poetry, what are the feelings that you have about the young Robert Morgan at that age?
Well, the voice is somewhat different, and certainly the poetry is mostly in free verse. These days I write mostly in metrics. I've become much more interested in the formal aspects of poetry over the years. But I recognize in some of the early work there's something authentic. It was mine. And that's the most important thing for a young writer to feel, that whether it's good or bad, or whether it's great or good, it's yours. It's the best you can do at this time. It's the most authentic thing you can do. You've carved it down to some sort of essence. And I must say, in a few of those early poems, looking at them, I still feel that. They have something. There is perception there. There's honest observation of the world and of imagination perceiving things at a metaphorical level, which is so important in poetry.
You came to writing novels in the late 90s with your first published novel, Gap Creek. Changed your career dramatically. Can you tell us about writing it?
It didn't change my career dramatically, but Oprah gave me millions of new readers. That's the most important thing. The greatest honor that an author can have is to be read. The prizes are nice, etc., money is nice, but the greatest thing is to be read. And Oprah gave me literally millions of new readers. Gap Creek was actually my third novel. I'd published The Hinterlands and The Truest Pleasure before that. But it certainly put me on the New York Times bestseller list, gave me a visibility, and helped with the sales of other books also.
Can you talk a little bit about the transition from writing short stories to writing Hinterlands and novels? That transition, what was the thing that was happening in your life at that point that you said, okay, I want to try my hand at writing a novel now?
What happened was the stories got longer. A short story is very much like a poem. It happens fast. It has, it's like a high dive. It has to arc just right and go into the water just right. But I got interested in expanding the fictive world around the characters and to following the characters. So the stories got to be 30 pages, and they got to be 50 pages. And I'll tell you what is the greatest breakthrough I have ever had as a writer. Spring of 1989, I wanted to write a novella or a novel based on the life and death of my Uncle Robert, who was killed in a B-17 crash in England in 1943. I did a lot of research, I read manuals, I interviewed pilots, navigators, bombardiers. I found the site of the crash in England. I could not get started. I had absorbed so much technical information about strategic bombing in World War II. And one day I thought, well, since I can't get started, why don't I create a fiancé for this soldier and let her tell part of the story? And that was so scary to think of writing from the point of view of a woman. What did I know about how she would think and remember these things? But I said to myself, I will become like an actor. I will erase myself to get into this character. And by the time I had 30 pages, I knew it was the best thing I'd ever written. I had escaped from my own world into the imagination. And came The Mountains Won't Remember Us, which led to the novels, most of them narrated by women characters.
Fascinating. Again, the author is Robert Morgan. The book that he's currently on tour for is Lions of the West, published with Algonquin Books. Check it out. So what was the experience? Oh, I'm being told are we out of time in the back? I was just going to ask quickly, in 30 seconds or less, what was the experience like being selected by Oprah and that change? 30 seconds.
Well, it was pure pleasure. It was a surprise. I had never watched her show. I thought it was a Book of the Month Club kind of thing, and instead of selling 30,000 copies, it sold many hundreds of thousands of copies. But all I had to do on the show was nod and smile and thank people for saying wonderful things about the book, and suddenly I was getting emails and letters, fan letters from really all over the world, including Germany and Holland, places like that. So I really enjoyed it.
Great. Again, the author is Robert Morgan. The book that he's on tour for is Lions of the West. We're just about out of time for this week's episode of The Artist Craft. For all of us here, Michael and Marnie working hard in the back, I want to thank Robert for joining us in studio today. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Thanks so much. Always a bit of a rush there at the end.
Great.
You did great, though. Thank you very much.